If this sounds like you, stay with me for a moment. Before I begin, can I ask, what country are you listening from today? And if you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, like your presence only mattered when you were useful, you might want to subscribe. This story wasn't planned, but it feels like it's meant for someone who's listening right now. I didn't think much of the date at first. It was circled on my calendar, sure, but quietly. No reminders sent, no group messages, just a small note written in my handwriting, the same way I'd been marking important moments for years, without expecting anyone else to notice. It was a milestone, one I'd worked toward for a long time, something that, in another version of my life, might have come with congratulations, maybe even pride. Instead, the day arrived like any other. No calls, no texts, no acknowledgement. I told myself not to read into it. Everyone's busy. Families grow complicated. People forget things that don't involve them directly. I made coffee. I went about my morning. I tried to treat it like a normal day, but it wasn't normal to me. This milestone represented years of sacrifice, late nights, careful planning, quiet resilience. It was proof that something I'd built, slowly, patiently, had finally reached solid ground. I didn't need applause, but I had hoped for recognition. At least "we're proud of you." By noon, my phone was still silent. What hurt wasn't just the lack of attention. It was the contrast. Because my family had no problem remembering dates when they needed something. They remembered birthdays when gifts were expected, holidays when money was tight, emergencies when a check or a transfer could smooth things over. I'd become dependable in a way that made me invisible. The irony is, they didn't start out ungrateful. Or maybe they did, and I just didn't notice. It happened gradually, the way entitlement often does. One favor turned into another. Support became expected. Help became assumed. I'd always been the responsible one, the one who planned ahead, the one who didn't panic, the one who could be counted on to fix things quietly, without fuss. And over time, that identity hardened into something else. They stopped asking. They started assuming. I helped pay for things that weren't my responsibility, covered shortfalls, filled gaps. I told myself it was temporary, that family helps family, that things would even out eventually. But they never did. On the day of my milestone, the group chat was active. Just not about me. They were discussing a weekend getaway, a restaurant reservation. Someone joked about how expensive things had gotten, and another replied with a laughing emoji and said, "Good thing we've got help." I stared at that message longer than I should have. Good thing we've got help. No name attached. No acknowledgement of where that help came from. Just an assumption woven so naturally into conversation that no one questioned it. That's when it hit me. They didn't ignore my milestone because they forgot. They ignored it because it didn't fit the version of me they were comfortable with. Celebrating me would mean seeing me as more than a resource, more than a safety net, more than someone who existed to make their lives easier. And that realization hurt, in a way I wasn't prepared for. I didn't confront anyone that day. I didn't send a passive-aggressive message. I didn't post anything online. I just sat with the truth, letting it settle into places I'd avoided looking at for a long time. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and opened a folder on my computer, one I hadn't touched in years. Inside were spreadsheets, records, transfers, notes, numbers that told a story I'd never said out loud. A story about who'd really been funding the life they were all enjoying. I didn't plan what came next. I just knew something had shifted. And once you see yourself clearly in a family dynamic, you can't unsee it. For a few days after that, I didn't say anything. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to be sure of myself. I'd learned the hard way that reacting too quickly in family situations often turns into regret. So I waited. I watched. I listened. And the more I paid attention, the clearer everything became. My milestone passed completely unmentioned. Not even a belated, "Oh, by the way." Meanwhile, the plans they'd been chatting about moved forward easily. Hotel booked. Restaurant confirmed. Someone shared a photo of a new outfit they'd bought just for the trip. Another complained about how stressful it was to keep up with expenses lately. I almost laughed at that, because I knew exactly where the stress relief had been coming from. It wasn't just one big thing. It was dozens of small ones. Monthly help that was just until things settle. Covering tuition gaps, paying off credit cards, helping with rent during a rough patch that somehow lasted years. Contributing to vacations I wasn't invited on, bailing someone out of a bad investment, quietly absorbing costs so no one else had to feel the impact of their choices. I'd never demanded recognition for it. In fact, I'd avoided it. I didn't want to be seen as controlling or boastful. I told myself generosity was best when it was quiet. But quiet generosity has a shadow side. When no one sees the support, they start believing they earned the comfort themselves. The realization didn't come with anger at first. It came with sadness. A deep, almost embarrassing sadness. Because part of me had believed that even if they didn't say it, they knew. That on some level, they understood what I was contributing. They didn't. Or worse, they did. And it simply didn't matter. The moment that finally pushed me from reflection into action happened during a family dinner later that week. I almost didn't go. Something in me wanted to stay home, to protect myself. But another part of me knew avoidance would only keep the pattern alive. So I went. The conversation flowed easily. Jokes, complaints, plans. My milestone still untouched, sitting between us like an invisible object no one wanted to acknowledge. At one point, someone raised a glass. Not for me, but for a new purchase. A car, paid for after a lot of hard work. I felt something tighten in my chest. Hard work. I smiled politely. I always did. But inside, a line was being crossed. Later that evening, as dessert was being served, someone joked about how lucky we all were to have things work out financially. Another chimed in, "Yeah, somehow it always does." That was when I spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. "It doesn't just work out," I said. The table went quiet. Forks paused midair. They looked at me, confused, curious, slightly annoyed. I continued, "I think it's time we talk honestly about how things have been working out." There was an uncomfortable shuffle. Someone laughed nervously. "What do you mean?" I took a slow breath. My heart was pounding, but my voice stayed steady. I mean the financial support, the help I've been providing for years. A few faces changed immediately. Surprise, defensiveness, calculation. "That's not fair," someone said quickly. "No one asked you to." "I know," I replied. "And that's part of the problem." I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stated facts. Dates, amounts, patterns. Not every detail, but enough to make it impossible to dismiss. The room felt heavier with every sentence. Someone tried to interrupt. Someone else changed the subject. But I didn't let it drift away. For the first time, I held the center of the conversation without apologizing for it. "I'm not bringing this up to shame anyone," I said. "I'm bringing it up because today was an important day for me, and it passed without a word." That made me realize something. They waited. I've been present when you needed support, but when it comes to my life, my work, my milestones, I'm invisible. And I don't think that's accidental. No one responded right away. That silence was different from the others. It wasn't dismissive. It was exposed. One person finally said, "We didn't know it mattered that much to you." That hurt more than anything else. "Of course it mattered," I said quietly. "I just stopped asking you to notice." The betrayal wasn't loud. It wasn't malicious. It was passive, comfortable, built on years of me making myself smaller so others could live larger. And once it was spoken out loud, there was no going back. What I didn't expect was how quickly the room would try to put everything back the way it was. Almost immediately, the explanation started. Not apologies, explanations. Someone said they'd assumed I was doing fine. Someone else said they thought I liked helping. Another reminded me that family doesn't keep score. That phrase landed wrong, Because I hadn't been keeping score. I'd been keeping the family afloat. As the conversation stretched on, I felt myself splitting in two. One part of me stayed calm, answering questions, clarifying details. The other part was watching from a distance, stunned by how hard everyone worked to avoid responsibility without ever actually denying the facts. No one said, "You're right, we overlooked you." No one said, "We should have celebrated you." Instead, they focused on tone, on timing, on how uncomfortable the conversation made them feel. That was when the emotional collapse really began. Not in a dramatic way, but internally. Quiet, private, the kind that doesn't look like breaking down, but like going numb. I excused myself early that night. I said I was tired. That part wasn't a lie. When I got home, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I just sat there, feeling the weight of something irreversible. Because once you say the truth out loud, you can't pretend you don't know it anymore. The days that followed were heavy. Messages came in, but they were strange, polite, distant, some overly cheerful, like nothing had happened. Others carried a faint edge of resentment, as if I'd violated an unspoken rule by naming what everyone preferred to leave vague. One message said, "We didn't realize you felt this way. You should have said something sooner." That one stayed with me. Because I had. Just not loudly, not disruptively, not in a way that forced anyone to change. I started questioning myself in the quiet moments. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe this was just how families worked. Maybe expecting recognition was selfish. Maybe milestones were only important if they affected other people. That's the dangerous part of long-term emotional neglect. It trains you to distrust your own reactions. I noticed the physical signs first. I couldn't sleep through the night. I lost my appetite. My chest felt tight in the mornings, like I was bracing for impact even when nothing was happening. I replayed conversations over and over, rewriting them in my head, imagining softer versions of myself who wouldn't have made things awkward. There was denial too, but it came dressed as hope. Hope that someone would reach out differently. Hope that someone would say, "We messed up." Hope that recognition would arrive late, but sincere. It didn't. Instead, the dynamic shifted in subtle ways. Requests slowed down, not out of respect, but discomfort. The ease they'd once had around me was gone. I'd changed the script, and they didn't know their lines anymore. Part of me missed that old version of things. The predictability, the feeling of being needed, even if it came at a cost. That surprised me. I'd expected relief. What I felt was grief. Grief for the role I'd played so well that no one noticed it was destroying me. The consequences weren't just emotional. They were relational. Invitations became less frequent. Conversations stayed shallow. I could feel myself being repositioned, not as a pillar, but as a problem that had to be handled carefully. And that hurt more than I wanted to admit. One evening, I caught myself drafting a message apologizing for how things came out. I stared at the screen for a long time, my thumb hovering over send. The words felt familiar, comfortable, like slipping back into an old coat that never quite fit but kept me warm enough. I deleted the message. That small act felt harder than the confrontation itself. Because consequences don't always come from what you say. Sometimes they come from what you refuse to take back. I started spending more time alone. Not out of spite, but necessity. I needed space to hear myself think again, to separate guilt from responsibility, to understand where my role ended and theirs began. In that quiet, something uncomfortable surfaced. I had enabled this. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but through years of overgiving without boundaries, I taught people how to treat me. I'd filled every gap before anyone else felt it. I'd absorbed pressure that wasn't mine. And in doing so, I'd made my presence optional and my absence unthinkable. That realization didn't excuse their behavior, but it changed how I saw myself in the story. And it hurt. Rebuilding didn't start with anyone else. That was the hardest part to accept. For a long time, I kept waiting for a signal from my family. Some acknowledgement, some softened tone, some indication that they'd reflected on what I said. I told myself that once that happened, I'd know how to move forward. But days turned into weeks, and the silence settled into something permanent. That's when it became clear. If I waited for them to validate my experience, I might be waiting forever. So I started small, painfully small. I stopped volunteering explanations. I stopped filling conversational gaps with reassurance. When someone complained about money, I listened without reaching for my wallet. When plans were discussed, I didn't offer to cover anything. Not as a punishment, just as a pause. And that pause changed everything. People noticed immediately. The tone shifted. There were awkward jokes about how things must be tight for me. Gentle probing questions disguised as concern. Someone even said, half laughing, "We'll try not to rely on you so much." That told me more than they realized. The guilt came in waves, sometimes sharp, sometimes dull. Years of conditioning don't disappear just because you recognize them. I had to fight the urge to rescue people from discomfort they were capable of handling themselves. I reminded myself daily, support is not the same as self-erasure. The confrontation I'd been avoiding came unexpectedly. One family member asked to meet for coffee. They looked tired when they sat down, defensive before a word was spoken. "I feel like you've pulled away," they said. I nodded. "I have." "Why?" they asked, genuinely confused. I took a breath, because I needed to see who would still show up if I stopped carrying everything. They didn't like that answer. I could see it. It challenged the version of events where everyone was doing their best, and no one was responsible for the imbalance. "You're making things difficult," they said quietly. I didn't argue. I just replied, I was making things easy at my own expense. That was the moment I realized recovery isn't about fixing relationships. It's about telling the truth inside them and letting them survive or not. Some didn't. A few relationships faded. Not dramatically, just slowly, like people setting down something heavy they didn't want to carry anymore. And as painful as that was, it was also clarifying. Others surprised me. One relative called weeks later and said awkwardly, "I didn't realize how much you were doing. I should have said something sooner." It wasn't perfect. It wasn't poetic. But it was real. And I held on to that. My life got quieter, simpler. I spent more time doing things that had nothing to do with being useful. Walking, reading, sitting with my thoughts without rushing to turn them into solutions for someone else. And something strange happened. I started to feel solid. Not important. Not needed. Just solid. The milestone that had been ignored didn't shrink in hindsight. If anything, it grew, because I finally allowed myself to feel proud without waiting for permission. I celebrated it privately. A nice meal, a long evening reflecting on how far I'd come, not just in measurable achievements, but in emotional survival. I learned that being generous doesn't mean being endless, that love without boundaries turns into obligation, that families don't always mean harm, but they often normalize imbalance when it benefits them. And I learned that stepping out of a role people depend on will always upset the system. That doesn't mean you're wrong. It means the system was built around your silence. Today, things are different. Not perfect, not healed in a storybook way, but honest. I help when I want to. I give when it feels aligned, not automatic. And when my life matters, I say so, without shrinking, without apologizing. So if you're listening to this and you've ever felt overlooked while quietly holding everything together, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't disappear just because no one claps. Your worth doesn't depend on how much you carry. And recognition delayed is still recognition.s, especially when you give it to yourself. Let me leave you with this question, and I hope you'll sit with it before answering. If you stopped funding everyone else's comfort, emotionally, financially, silently, who would still see you?